So you're right. Inflation is the biggest story. We all know what happened to gas prices, food prices, other goods and services, airline tickets. You're absolutely right about that, Julia. But there are two kinds of inflation, broadly speaking. There's what's called cost push. This comes from the supply side. So that's what we had in 1974. That's what we had now, which is it's coming from higher commodity prices, higher energy prices, energy shortages, supply chain bottlenecks, higher input costs, a lot of other factors. So it's coming from the supply side. The other kind of inflation is called demand pull. This comes from consumers. This comes from individuals, and it's a psychological thing. People say, gee, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. I better go out and buy it now because the price is going to go up. If I wait 3 months, it's going to cost me 10% more. So I'll go buy it now, or a new car, or anything. A suit, a dress, anything you want. Go buy it now. Because the price is just going to go up. That's demand pull inflation. And then that plays out in terms of wages. People want to raise. We went through this in the late 70s. I was working at Citibank at the time. They used to just give us raises without even asking. They would just say, hey, we're going to raise your salary, whatever, $20,000 or whatever, because they knew people would quit, or they were going to ask for it sooner or later. They were just trying to keep ahead of things. And that was true on, I was in New York at the time. I was on Madison Avenue, finance, anything you could think of. So we don't have that yet. Right now, the demand pull inflation has not kicked in. The cost push inflation, and that's what you're seeing at the grocery store, and that's what you were describing, is there. It's what's driving inflation. The difference is the Fed has absolutely no direct power over the supply side. They don't drill for oil. They don't run farms. They don't pilot ships. They don't drive trucks. They don't unload in the docks of the Port of Los Angeles. They don't do anything that could alleviate supply bottlenecks or supply chain bottlenecks. They can control the demand side, even though demand is not the problem. See, this is the point. They can control the demand side by raising interest rates and tightening money, but demand is not the problem. It's not where the inflation is coming from. But if you crush it enough, if you destroy enough demand, it will feed through in terms of lower prices, even with supply side constraints. And just to be a little blunt on the subject, people complain that gas prices went up, and they did. They went from $2.40 a gallon to $5 a gallon or more, depending on where you were. $5 was the national average according to AAA. Well, they came down a little bit in July and August, kind of not all the way back, but maybe closer to $4. All right, that's in the right direction. But the old saying, the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. In other words, the price itself destroys demand. There's a recursive function or circularity to it. And if you want to get the price of gas down, get unemployment up to 7%, because people who aren't working aren't using any gas. It's not a question of having to pay $4 a gallon or $5 a gallon. If you just got fired and you're sitting home, you're not buying any gas or very little, and that'll bring the price down. So we are so the way it works is raise interest rates, tighten money, reduce the balance sheet, et cetera. Get unemployment up. It doesn't sound like a desirable goal, but that's what it takes, and that's what happened in 1982. Get unemployment high enough so people are buying hamburger instead of steak. They're buying, whatever's the least expensive thing on the shelf, day old bread instead of new bread, or they're not buying gasoline because they're not going to work, et cetera. That will bring prices down, but at a very high cost, which we just talked about, which is high unemployment and lower productivity. Meanwhile, the U.S. debt keeps going up. We haven't really talked about the debt issue, but so it starts to, that part of it looks like 1981. But if you throw in a global financial crisis, which I mentioned, but we haven't really drilled down on that, then it starts to look more like 2008.
Got it. So many things to pick apart there and explore further. You mentioned the debt. This is an area I know that you've been focused on, and can we explore that a bit and some of the consequences? And it feels like we're not having this conversation enough. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts.
On which, on this, how this recession, or what
Well,
aspect in particular?
the debt part of the equation
Oh,
too.
right, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
especially
yeah,
in
yeah.
a rising rate environment as well.
Yeah, well, that's like a glacier. I do a lot of high altitude mountaineering, so you're living on glaciers on an expedition for weeks at a time. Glaciers are extremely powerful, but they move extremely slowly. Some exceptions, but they kind of like, an inch a year, a couple inches a year. But they move mountains. I mean, they create rivers, they create canyons, they move mountains. They're extremely powerful but slow. That's a good metaphor for the impact of debt. And when I talk about debt, in particular with the United States, but it applies to any country, I focus on the debt to GDP ratio, because you can't really talk about debt in isolation without thinking about the capacity to pay the debt. And a simple example, if you have a $50,000 balance on your credit card and you're making $30,000 a year and trying to pay rent in New York, et cetera, good luck. You're probably going to go bankrupt, or at least default on that card. But if you owe $50,000 on your credit card, but you're making $5 million a year, it's, you just write a check. It's no big deal. My point is, you can't look at a $50,000 debt and decide if it's a problem or not unless you compare it to the income. And if it's too low, it's a problem. And if the income's high, not a problem. So that's why you use the debt to GDP ratio. The US just hit $31 trillion in national debt. That is national debt, almost all of it in the form of US Treasury securities. Not all of it, there are other obligations, but mostly US Treasury securities. Well, is that a problem or not? Well, one way to answer the question is compare it to GDP, do the ratio. The answer is that ratio is now a little over 130%. At the beginning of the Trump administration, it was 106%. So Trump and Biden together have taken it up 25 percentage points, from 106 to 131. What was it in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected? The answer is 30%. 30% is completely comfortable. That's like the person with the $50,000 debt who's making millions. No big deal. 30% is comfortable. 50%, yeah, getting up there. Angela Merkel and all her years in Germany, and there's a lot of research to back this up, says that 60% was the limit. And that's what the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union and the European Central Bank, that was their goal. They said, don't go over 60%. If you do, you're expected to take measures, raise taxes or reduce debt or reduce spending, do something to get that back down under 60%. What's the critical threshold? When I say critical threshold, that's from physics, but it turns out that a lot of the models that economists use are junk. But if you use complexity theory and physics models and bring them over to economics, and which is what I've done over the last 20 years, they work extremely well because they're complex dynamic systems. One's money, one's particles and waves, but they have a lot in common. But if you say, what's the critical threshold where water turns to steam, or water turns to ice, or something changes in such a way that it's not the same, it's radically different, but it happens very quickly? The best research says the answer is 90%. And this comes out of Ken Rogoff at Harvard, also Carmen Reinhart, who's now the chief economist at the World Bank. Vincent Reinhart, her husband, has done a lot of research, and a lot of others. So it's not just Rogoff and Reinhart, although they were the leaders in this. But they've looked at hundreds of cases over hundreds of years. And I like that because it's not just kind of cherry picking data. Developed economies, developing economies, economies that issue debt in their own currencies, ones that issue debt in other currencies, principally US dollars, et cetera. So, a wide variety of case studies. And they show that when your debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, your multiplier of additional debt goes below 1. So just to put that in context, at 30%, if I borrow $1 and spend $1, I might get $1.30 of growth. Assuming you spend it wisely. That's a big condition. But you borrow $1 and spend $1 and get $1.30 of growth. Okay, the debt was productive if you put it to good use. But that $1.30 gets smaller and smaller. As you get closer to 90%, it goes to $1.20, $1.10, $1.05. Past 90%, roughly, you borrow $1 and you spend $1 and you only get 95 cents of growth. You don't get your dollar back in terms of GDP. And then 90% and 85%, et cetera. So 90% is the critical threshold. The US is at 131%, highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth, or you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. Now, debt crises of that magnitude, by the way, if you ask a separate question, say, well, who else is at that lunch table? Who else has a debt to GDP ratio of about 130% or higher? The answer is Lebanon, Greece, Italy. Those are your mates at the lunch table. That's where the United States is. Now, Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain of modern monetary theory. She's a professor at State University of New York, Stony Point. And I met her, very, very nice lady, but we disagree pretty radically in terms of modern monetary theory.